Hello and welcome to week 2 of Self-Identity and Agency. This week we are interested in the Enlightenment idea of the self. When we talk about the Enlightenment, what we're referring to is a particular moment in Western history, roughly around the 1700s, where we see the beginnings of a distinctly modern way of thinking of these ideas. So our aim this week is to tell the story of how those ideas emerged, how they interacted with ideas that had come before, and how they've subsequently shaped our worldview. But before then, what I would like to do, and I want to do this each week, is just spend a couple of minutes recapping what it is we talked about last week. The aim here is in doing this, it gives you a sense of the continuities and shifts that will happen as we move through this material, but also hopefully give you a sense of the overall argument that we're going to be developing over the duration of the semester. So one of the general sort of themes that we touched on last week is this idea that the self, or our sense of selfhood, is something that we both at times conceal and at other times reveal. So this process of concealing and revealing, or hiding and revealing, is a process that we engage with all the time. Pretty much every time we come in contact with another person, there is at some level an awareness taking place of how are these signals or stories, how is this sort of performative process that I'm taking part in, how is that being received by other people? So thinking about the nature of those exchanges of both performance but also reception can be a really useful way of digging into some of the complexity around our sense of selfhood, identity, and also the possibilities of freedom. More generally, we also talked about these ideas of self-identity agency as representing departure points for picking up on a number of the themes that we're going to be touching on this semester. By departure points, I guess the invitation there is to suggest that we're not suggesting, or we're not making claims about what your destination is going to be, about what you should think about these ideas, but more to create a space for starting to unpack them and to think about how they play out in a real world context. We also talked briefly last week about the assessment in the course that kicks off this week, and in particular our first assessment task, this sort of introduction to who you are in the world. I won't talk about that in any detail here, but instead I'll post another video where I set out some pointers for doing that task that I think may be useful. Okay, so our objectives for this week. So there's 3 big things that I want to do. The first, in the Western context, is I want to trace an historical story about how this idea of selfhood or humanness has developed over time. I'm going to do that by breaking that 2,500 year history up into 4 distinct periods. So that's the sort of method that we're going to use. Of those periods, there's one in particular that I'm going to focus on, and this comes out of this phenomena we call the liberal tradition. So when we say liberal here, we're talking about a philosophical or ideological way of thinking about the world. And it's one in which our sense of selfhood and human potential is very much grounded in an idea of the individual. So individualism directly comes out of this liberal tradition, among other things, and which in turn came out of that Enlightenment project. So that's going to be the point where I guess we dwell and unpack some of these ideas, because, as I said, they've had a profound influence and continue to have a profound influence on how we understand our sense of selfhood today. I also want to talk a little bit about the kind of language that people have used over time to also capture and make sense of many of these ideas. I'm going to be making the claim that in the Western world, and the Western tradition in particular, there is a kind of binary logic that underpins a lot of this way of thinking about selfhood. So by binaries, we mean sort of setting up ideas or developing arguments about ideas in terms of particular contrasts. So reason, for example, becomes contrasted with something like emotion. What a binary way of thinking then does, it tends to obscure a lot of the overlap or the fuzziness around these ideas, but instead presents them as sort of good, bad, right, wrong, reason, emotion, man, woman, this sort of logic that runs through a lot of these ways of thinking. So being aware of that logic, I think, can be quite useful in unpacking and potentially identifying some of the limitations in the worldviews that we're going to be talking about in this first half of the course in particular. Okay, so I said a moment ago, we're going to be taking a long or broad historical sweep of over, roughly 2,500 years of human development in the Western world. Not going to spend a lot of time on doing this because our aim isn't to tell a nuanced or even really detailed story. Instead, it's painting in fairly broad brushstrokes some of the key shifts and ideas that have taken place to this story of what it means to be human and how we understand humanness and the consequences of that for identity, selfhood, and agency or freedom. So to do this, I'm going to break the story up into 4 broad periods. So the first, the ancient world of Athens and Rome. Then we skip ahead to the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and then dwell for a little while, as I said a moment ago, on the Enlightenment. So rather than trying to sort of pick up on every detail that I'm talking about here or use this as a reason for running off and sort of, burying yourself in all of this content. Instead, what I'd really encourage you to think about is during each of these periods, what was the dominant story for thinking about humanness and identity? What were the key sort of features that each of these periods stressed and the kind of relationships that they accentuated? Because I think if you come at it that way, you both have an understanding of how these ideas can be understood as quite different to one another, but in other ways you can also, or it helps point to some similarities between them as well. This process that I mentioned a moment ago about carving human history up into 4 distinct periods is a very artificial process. People didn't wake up one morning and say, okay, everybody, we've now moved from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance or the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. This is it's a strategy for making sense of this complexity. So there are obvious dangers in doing this, that we sort of compartmentalise very different and potentially quite similar experiences of the world. But we've got to start somewhere, and I think this can be a useful way of starting the story that we're going to be developing over subsequent weeks. Okay, so let's start with the ancient world, Athens and Rome. So I think for many of us in the Western world, at least, both Athens and I guess to a lesser degree Rome, or in a slightly different way, represent a sort of the beginnings of a worldview that is directly recognisable to us today. So the forms of philosophy, the processes of science, politics and art that was developed and emerged at this time is very much resonates with the way that we understand art, beauty, politics, power today as well. So there is in some ways there is a very distinct thread that runs from those ancient civilizations right through to us today. Interest in ethics, politics, and the consequences of freedom and agency, so in a lot of ways the subject matter for this course, was something that was of deep interest to thinkers and philosophers, statesmen at this time as well. So what was also happening though is that these were understood very much in the context of a relationship to God, or gods in the plural. This was a world in which human excellence and achievement was always being sort of tempered against this concern about overstepping or upsetting or angering the gods, who, as I said, were constantly sort of looking on. And that's where we get this idea of hubris from. So in it, like our modern sort of idea of karma, of overstretching, trying to do too much, trying to claim too much power or authority, that there is these sort of consequences that will tend to come from that. And from the Athenian and sort of Roman worldview, one of the consequences would be this sort of retribution that would come from the gods. So this idea of balance is also something that comes through in this ancient worldview. Balance, moderation, sort of seeking out these a sense of evenness, so that human achievement can take place and progress, but it always needs to be moderated or limited in some ways as well. What we also see taking place at this time is a lot of thought and reflection, writing, and then political sort of engagement with this idea of the other. So these were periods in the ancient world where trade and the more general spread of ideas, Rome's imperial ambitions, saw these cultures and societies come in contact with lots of different groups in lots of different ways or under lots of different circumstances. So what that meant in practice was that there was a tremendous awareness of how sameness and difference often marked these exchanges. There were obvious markers of sameness and difference about appearance and what gods people prayed to and the language they used and the rest of it. But it was not a sort of a clear-cut case. So there was also this sense that ran through each of these Greek and Roman traditions as well about what it would take to incorporate different groups into that dominant group and what that might look like in practice. From the Greek perspective, that was often posed as a sort of philosophical or an ethical set of challenges. For the Romans, for whom, as I said a moment ago, had imperial ambitions, this was also very much a practical consequence of what happens when they lay claim to communities and cultures and societies as their empire spreads. How do you bring new people into the fold? So from a Roman perspective, this idea of difference, how much of that could be overcome by a more general category like Roman citizenship? Who could be granted membership as part of the group, and what are the consequences that follow on from that? So if we jump ahead to the medieval world, and again, this is a long period of time that I've reduced down to a single slide in a PowerPoint presentation. But when we talk about the medieval period, I guess we're referring to something that runs from, say, the 5th or 6th century right through to the 14th century. Lots of quite distinct ways of thinking about identity and selfhood, and lots of attempts to sort of, renegotiate or rethink the role of God in these accounts as well. One of the useful ways of undertaking this analysis, but it's also slightly dangerous in a sense, is to take some of the dominant representations or images of each of these periods we're looking at and sort of use them to provide an insight into the overarching or underlying logic that was prevalent at the time. In the medieval world, this, as the image I've got here represents, there was a very distinct and very significant sort of attempt to map out quite visually how this whole thing, society, the universe, how it all was structured and where different parts of this, how the different parts of this work together to create this thing that that was then thought of as some sort of natural order. So I guess in a very literal sense, what you see is a very hierarchical set of relationships, and the detail isn't terrific. So let me just sort of quickly describe what I'm looking at and hopefully what you can see in this slide. So we have this thing called the great or the universal chain of being. At the very top of this structure, we have God, and Satan is at the bottom. Now, from God down, we have, as I said, a very hierarchical, very structural sort of a model of where the different parts of it fit. So we have, gods, then we've got angels, then we've got royalty, we've got people in their various forms, then we've got all sorts of animals, and then it flows into the sort of natural world as well. So you've got trees and mountains and all the rest of it, right down to dirt and gravel, and then Satan beneath that. So the logic of this is that, or one of the sort of at the time, recognisable sort of stories that comes out from this is that there is a system of value that is built into this system, and value and prestige and importance flows downward. So God is at the top, God oversees the rest of the structure, and the idea here is that each of these levels of the structure have both a duty to respect the level above them, but also a duty or a responsibility to look after those beneath them. And we see a lot of variations of this image, some of them incredibly detailed, where you've got, distinctions being made, or hierarchical distinctions being made between different kinds of animals, so that, a tiger is above a mouse kind of thing. So in terms of its virtue or its strength or its character or whatever, and again, strength, value at the top, and then, as I said, that flows down. So human beings, in this sense, from a medieval perspective or from the medieval worldview, occupy an interesting place. In the one sense, it's a special place because human beings resemble God in this worldview, so they've got that going for them. But while they may resemble God, they're also subject to a whole set of limitations by virtue of their embodiment that God is not subject to, so that humans die, they decay, that sin is part of their makeup as well. So again, through this hierarchical structure, we've got a sense of order, we've got a sense of value, we've got a sense of responsibility, and we've got a very clear-cut story being told about how all the various parts fit together to both keep everything in check, but also to be able to tell a story of who goes where and what responsibilities you have to other people. The fact that God plays such an overarching role in this worldview, I guess, is one of those key points to use as a contrast to the Athenian and Roman view that we looked at a moment ago. So skipping ahead to the Renaissance, so again, just in rough terms, we're talking about a period from, say, the 14th to the 17th centuries. So the word Renaissance is quite useful for us here. So we've got, coming from the French for rebirth or to be born again. So what is being born again, or what is being sort of rediscovered in this sense, are those Greek and Roman ideas that we touched upon briefly earlier. So this is a reassertion of humanness, and the idea that, I guess, in a lot of ways, a challenge to that medieval, very structured, very rigid account of how all of this is supposed to work. What we see in the Renaissance period is this reassertion of humanness and agency and freedom via the intellect and via science and rationality and the rest of it. So again, to the way that it is reinventing or recreating these older ideas, we have this notion of man, quote unquote, is the measure of all things. So rather than seeing man as a step, humanity as a step within this ordered or structured hierarchy, as we saw in the medieval world, humanity gets drawn front and centre to understanding how the whole thing works in practice. So human experience at the fore, and what that does in turn then is start to downplay or push to one side other influences or other accounts of what it means to be human and where humans fit relative to one another. What we also see during the Renaissance period is the rise of science and particular kinds of knowledge being deployed to supplement this story of humanness as well. So we see the empirical exploration of the known world. So when we talk about empirical, what we're referring to is efforts to use our sense knowledge, so things that we can see and count and hear and taste and measure, to develop a story about how the world works and what it looks like from a human's perspective. So this is taking place and creating particular kinds of research traditions, albeit fairly slowly. But what we're also seeing is the beginnings of large-scale scientific exploration and enterprises as well, and some quite profound shifts in those big scientific stories that are getting told about how the universe operates. One of the distinctions that's often made is from a geocentric to a heliocentric view of the universe. So what that means in its most simplified sort of account is that a geocentric view of the universe is one that held that the Earth is at the centre of everything, and then that everything sort of radiated out from there. A heliocentric account positions the sun at the centre, and that everything in our universe then revolves around that entity. So in one sense, this is both a story that emphasises science and humanity, but it's also one that positions humanity within these larger systems and structures. So what we see in practice is also that new metaphors and new being used to explain the universe and our role within it. These are things where we're thinking about, or people are thinking about, the kind of relationships and structures that made the universe possible. And in a lot of ways, the subtext here is about the role of God and where God fits or doesn't fit into that story. So now we jump ahead to the Enlightenment. So again, from the early 1700s to perhaps the late 1700s is a useful sort of way of bracketing this period of human history. What we also see at this time is a particular... So the Renaissance represented, as I said, a return to older Greek and Roman ways of thinking about science and politics, art, ethics, and the rest of it. What the Enlightenment took is that idea of there being a fundamental rationality. So reason and science coming together being the essential element that drives that whole process. And in fact, the Enlightenment in many ways was also pushing away some of the, what they believed were the sort of unnecessary influences of both the medieval world and the Renaissance world as well, and instead drawing focus in on, or really sort of zeroing in on, this idea of rationality. When God was discussed, and the God question is one that was very prominent during this period, it was often sort of responded to by arguments about deism. So deism is basically the idea of there being, or acknowledging that there may in fact be a supreme being, but suggesting that that being does not intervene in the operation of the world or the universe at that time. So that's an important, I guess in some ways, sort of a concession to talking about the significant role that even during this time the church continued to play in thinking about how the world works and about how each individual person's sort of life played out in that context. So this question about the God question, where does God fit? What role does God play in this story, becomes one that's quite fraught. As the Enlightenment period develops further, you get people become more and more sort of antagonistic to feeling the need to give such a concession to the existence of God. But that's something we'll pick up on later. But for now, I guess for us, it's important to sort of get our head around this idea that reason and rationality, so the ability to think and to act according to those thoughts, become the central part of this Enlightenment project. And then from that, we get sort of a suite of similar arguments being made, so that knowledge, in that sense, improves human life. Ignorance diminishes it. So education becomes a vehicle for thinking about both self-knowledge and awareness of how the whole thing works, but it becomes framed as a political and social imperative as well. Conventional wisdom and authority then, based on custom, religion, tradition, must be challenged, or it must at the very least be sort of filtered through these new ways of understanding that involve science and technology and the application of reason. So the application of reason gives this movement its real progress. Knowledge leads to progress, and from an Enlightenment perspective, progress, which I should actually have it there with a capital P, is presented as an almost good thing in and of itself. That the danger is to get stuck, or to stop growing, stop developing, stop learning, stop interrogating and asking and questioning and challenging. All of this needs to happen, and if it does happen, that will lead to progress. Progress is a good thing, and that then the whole system just keeps perpetuating itself. The image I have in the right-hand side of the screen is, the cover page of again, another one of these key sort of objects of the Enlightened period, and that's the encyclopedia. So again, what we see is an attempt to capture human achievement and apply these methods for understanding the world. So the encyclopedia is thought to become a sort of a foundation, so that once this information, these understandings, these experiments have been undertaken, truths have been uncovered, they're captured, and then they're used to push development on and on and on. So this is very much about the idea that knowledge can be cumulative and that it can grow over time. It can be used as the foundation for new forms of knowledge and new forms of understanding as well. So again, the human being, the rational thinking human being, is very much positioned at the very centre of this process. Older explanations about tradition, religion, God, culture more generally, expectations of communities, ways of doing it, all of that from an Enlightenment perspective needs to be reviewed, interrogated and assessed according to these newer, more powerful from their perspectives, understanding of reason and rationality. So our reading for this week, or one of the readings for this week, came from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, in a lot of ways became the sort of rallying point for a lot of this Enlightenment way of thinking, and the necessity to keep pushing this Enlightenment project forward, onward and onward, progress, development, and that the benefits would come from that. So Kant's article that you have a chance to have a look at was written in and circulated for a broad public audience. It wasn't a narrowly defined academic treatise like much of his other work, but more a sort of a response to this question, or this sort of concern or interest that many people had, is that we're hearing all this stuff about enlightenment. What does it mean? What does it actually, what does it constitute? How will our world change in relation to this enlightenment project? And what you are reading is Kant's response to this. And again, if you think about from the themes that we're developing in this course, this is very much a story, or it's developing an argument about the importance of responsibility, but thought, taking responsibility for your own actions, and then using knowledge, understanding, reason, science to drive and to assist in you in your journey through the world. Again, from Kant's perspective, this is both, it's an imperative that we start to act in this way, but there's also this acknowledgement that there are lots of structures, lots of conventions and cultural factors that work to sort of limit these expressions of selfhood and freedom and agency as well. So this is very much presented as a sort of a political statement about what it means to be enlightened from this perspective. So from that broad Enlightenment project, we then get this more narrowly defined set of ideas that cluster around this thing we call the liberal tradition. So I said at the very beginning, when we talk about liberal here, we're talking about a philosophical tradition that places the individual at the very core of the discussion. So what the liberal tradition was also doing is giving us another version or another account of what it means to be human. And as is their way, it was a very sort of prescriptive account. So you get liberal theorists and philosophers saying, in order to be human, you must. And here we have some sort of typical examples of this worldview. So to be human, you must hold the physical form. So you need to look like a human being. You need to be sensate. So sensate just means aware or conscious of your surroundings, the ability to see and hear and taste and touch and be sort of be guided by those experiences. To be reasoning and rational. So again, think about what's happening here. They're taking these ideas of, say, reasoning and the expression of rationality and making that core to what it means to be a human being. And to be able to express oneself and identity and identify as human. So this is obviously there is a grounding here in the individual, but they're also emphasising that there is a public role to be played, that to be a individual means to be able to assert a particular position, to hold particular values. And if you just look at that sort of criterion there we've got about what it means to be human, it's not difficult to think about, look at all the things that aren't being taken into account when we're getting an account of what it means to be human. So in one way, these are being presented to us at that time as very grand, very sort of ambitious accounts. But in a lot of ways, it's a very, very limiting sort of story that's being told. So just to expand on that just for a moment. So this idea that there are sort of base conditions that need to be met in order to be able to claim your position as a human being and part of this this community of individuals, there then comes an expectation that part of that process is also around participating in civil life. So again, using that rationality, using that process of engaging with others, of testing, of inquiring, of drawing on these new forms of knowledge, scientific insight and the rest of it. And that if you do that together, it will lead to some kind of progress. What we also see emerging then is both, as I said, a commitment to progress, but also this idea that there are particular values that are often not being stated directly, but underpin the sort of logic of this worldview. So we're seeing an emphasis on sameness or universalism, on equality of freedom and reason. So each of these are really loaded kind of concepts, but they're useful concepts, I guess, for thinking about the way this story gets told, about what it means to be human and about how a human being can potentially progress or develop in this kind of world. So I mentioned at the very beginning, what is also happening here, so we're seeing new forms of knowledge come to emerge, we're seeing new ways of thinking about the world, we're seeing new, very vivid stories being told about what it means to be human, and in a lot of sense these are presented as very open-ended and very sort of thoughtful engagements with these ideas. But beneath them, as many scholars have noted, there is also this kind of binary logic taking place. So a binary logic, as we said, in the terms of language, in the context of language, is drawing our attention to the way that our language is often structured through these kinds of contrasts. And the significance of that process is that in that contrast, one side of the binary, so one side of the two, will invariably be privileged. So for our content, or for what we've been talking about this week, we've got these binaries of reason versus emotion, order versus chaos, progress, stagnation. And these ideas run through all of these accounts. Sometimes they're quite explicit in the way that they use them to build a picture of the world, but at other times they're presented as simply self-evident that order is preferable to chaos, that reason is always superior to emotion, that progress is in and of itself a far better state than simply stagnating or stopping development. And there's lots and lots of these binaries that we can pick up on and explore this week. But again, I guess the point to take from this is that they're never presented as equal, and what tends to happen is they get lined up or aligned next to each other, again to tell a particular story of value and worth when it comes to being a human being. Okay, so we've covered lots of ground. So let me just take a moment just to sort of draw some of this together. So when we talked about the broad historical periods, or when we work through some of these historical periods, I guess the point I want to really emphasize that I made at the beginning is that there are always going to be continuities and breaks within these different or distinct periods. Each of them gives a somewhat different account of humanness, although as we see, there's also a sort of a looping effect where we can potentially return to older ideas as well. So the neatness inherent in doing this sort of thing, of mapping out human history in this kind of way, is itself, in some respects, a kind of a product of this very same worldview that we've been talking about. Just to answer my own question, this idea of the Enlightenment and its attempts to sort of map out and present in a logical, reasoned sort of way something as complex as human history becomes one of these powerful sort of breakthroughs at that time, but for us, continues this legacy of how we can think about, or how we're often encouraged to think about the world. If you fit within that dominant story, it becomes the stories become self-perpetuating or self-justifying in a sense. What tends to happen, or one of the dangers in doing that, of making this story too neat or presenting progress as a good thing in and of itself, is that we tend to skip over or lose track of the fact that even during the height of these moments, there were counter positions, there were contradictory evidence that wasn't always able to be fit with the stories that were being developed. So for us, being mindful of those alternative accounts, for thinking about, well, okay, so that's the story that's being told, but how else might we be able to account for this? Or, for example, from a sort of generating rhetorical question kind of perspective, is progress always a good thing in and of itself? Are we actually progressing? Well, a lot of our tools and technologies absolutely seem to be getting better and more efficient and faster and stronger and all the rest of it. Are we progressing morally, or are we progressing ethically as societies or as human beings? So thinking about those counter arguments can also be useful. I think too, what this is setting up is when we look next week at psychoanalysis and the influence of Sigmund Freud, we get a very different take on some of the problems inherent in relying too much on reason alone in giving an account of what it means to be human and how it all works. Until then, good luck, jump into the discussion boards, and we'll continue the discussion into some of these ideas. Cheers.